Hello and welcome to the Success Showcase. I'm your host, Eric Lopkin from the Modern Observer Group. And with me, as always, is Chip Janiszewski from the Happiness and Success GPS. Chip, how you doing this week?
Doing wonderful. How about you, Eric?
Doing fantastic. The new year is up and running.
It's January 14th and there's still no snow on the ground.
Which is rare for New England, but I'll take it.
Yep.
And that is not the case around the country. There have been some nasty blizzards in the Midwest and even in the South.
Yep. South and north. We're in the dry area, so not complaining at all.
Right, I'll take it.
Last year this time we had ice dams in the rivers and so on and so forth, and barges breaking that stuff up because everything had frozen from the. So it's different every year.
It is. And you know what they say about New England. If you don't like the weather, wait 5 minutes. It'll change.
Well, give us 30 today so we can get this podcast in.
All right. And with that segue, whether you work at a full-time job, you're an entrepreneur, you're looking for a job, whatever it is you're doing, at some point you are going to have to present to people. Whether it's a job interview and you're presenting to potential bosses, whether you're in corporate and you're presenting an idea or a report to your coworkers or supervisors, entrepreneurs making sales presentations, sales announcements, we all at one time or another have to present. So today we're going to talk about what you can do to make your presentation memorable, to get over the jitters that so many people have when presenting, and how to put your best foot forward. Now, I think the jitters is a good place to start because that tends to stop so many people from presenting. And I remember years ago, Jerry Seinfeld making a comment.
I saw a study that said speaking in front of a crowd is considered the number one fear of the average person. I found that amazing. Number 2 was death. Death is number 2? This means to the average person, if you have to be at a funeral, you would rather be in the casket than doing the eulogy.
That's a classic, but it is true in a lot of ways.
It is. It's the number one fear. And I think, I've studied a lot of what Steve Jobs did, and there's been a lot written about his presentation style because he was known for fantastic presentations. And the one thing he always stressed over and over again was practice. And he didn't have time to be nervous about it because he spent that time practicing. He knew everything that could go wrong, everything that could go right, how to fix what went wrong on the fly. They had it scripted down to the second. And he rehearsed it over and over again. And I think if you're one of those people that gets very nervous about presenting, that's really the first thing you need to do is script out what you're going to do and practice it. The more comfortable you are with the material, the less likely it is to bother you once you're actually presenting.
Yeah, and absolutely the most important thing to do is prepare properly. I mean, you know your material. It's really, really important to organize it up front, put it together, keep it simple. I mean, there's a lot of tips we're going to be going over today as far as that goes. But if you start out with something more simple, the bottom line is if you're going to be doing a talk about something, people aren't going to remember too much. So what a lot of people say is just give them 3 important things that they can take away, because the more that you're going to go on about different things, the more people are going to forget. So it's really, really important to prepare ahead of time. There's a really, really good book, which I'm sure a lot of you folks have heard about out there. Maybe you haven't heard about the book, but I'm sure everybody out there has heard of TED Talks. And TED Talks are basically 18-minute talks about whatever. And you can go on and just go to tedtalks.com, or you can go into YouTube, and they are all over the place. But there's a book that spawned this It's written by Carmen Gallo, who also wrote the book, he's the best-selling author of the presentation secrets of Steve Jobs, like you talked
Yep.
about. And this is Talk Like TED. And it's 9 public speaking secrets of the world's top minds. And people who have done TED Talks are everybody from Steve Jobs to Pope Francis to Barack Obama and a lot of other people out there. Plus, there's a lot of people who you've never heard of that have done excellent things. And they go from place to place. I don't think they're sponsored by TED, but you can actually do TED Talks in your area where you have a lot of people come just to practice their art. But the way that this is broken up, again, it's 9 public speaking secrets, and they're divided into 3 different types, 3 different categories. Number 1 is emotion, and then number 2 is novel, which is what the content is all about, and then number 3 is memorable. So we can go to the novel part because that's actually your content, and what they're talking about there. The 3 different topics there are: number 1 is teach people something new, and then number 2 is delivering jaw-dropping moments, and this is something that Bill Gates really worked on a lot. And then lightening up. The bottom line is you got to be yourself and not too serious. So it's really, really important to be looking at that stuff. So teaching people something new. Gallo, who's the author of the book, says an unfamiliar, unusual, or unexpected element in a presentation intrigues the audience, jolts them out of their preconceived notions, and quickly gives them a new way of looking at the world. So even if you're looking at some common subject matter, if you have a new way of presenting it, it's a great thing to put into your presentation.
Yeah, especially if you can surprise your audience. Surprise goes a long way. I mean, Steve Jobs was famous for his one more thing, and that was always the surprise. He kept it for the end. But even just the way you present things. I did a presentation just after Donald Trump was elected president. And I started my presentation with, we're going to talk about someone who was elected president controversially, put a lot of his own family members and nepotism in the White House, and was severely criticized for potentially being dangerous. And the upshot of this was I wasn't talking about Donald Trump. I was actually talking about Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But that switch got everybody's attention. So if you can surprise your audience where they think they know what you're going to say, and then it's something different, you've got their attention. And that's the first part of the battle right there, is getting their attention. So it's not just about what you're saying, it's how you're saying it. If you can put a different spin on it, it goes a long way to holding attention.
Yeah, absolutely. And I talked about point number 2 under this, and this is called delivering jaw-dropping moments. And this is really putting something that's supercharged into it. And it uses an example of Bill Gates. He wanted to make a point at a TED Talk about the dangers of malaria, and he brought along a jar of mosquitoes. And what Gates said was, malaria is, of course, transmitted by mosquitoes. I brought some here just so you could experience this. We'll let these roam around the auditorium a bit. There's no reason only poor people should have the experience. Now, it was a jaw-dropping moment. Of course, the mosquitoes that he brought posed no threat to the audience, but it was a very, very good way to emotionally charge the audience. And the bottom line is that if you're using that for your delivery, all of a sudden you're having fun up there, not thinking so much about what you're saying, and you got that audience very, very well engaged. It's a great way to make them a little bit more shocked and you a little bit more comfortable, and it's a lot of fun.
Absolutely. If you can engage the audience with humor, with a twist, however you can do it, and have fun with it, that right there goes a long way. 1, to making yourself more comfortable on stage. 2, to engaging your audience and keeping their attention. And 3, making sure they're actually listening. And that there is very important, because a lot of speakers lose their audience right at the beginning, either because they go in with something too technical and the audience tunes them out, or the biggest mistake I have seen speakers make is to have a PowerPoint presentation, read from the PowerPoint presentation, and hand out the slides in a handout. I've walked out on speakers who did this, because if all they're going to do is read the slides and they've already given me a copy of them, I don't need to spend the time listening to them. I can read through it at my own pace.
Yeah, and it's very, very boring, obviously. You touched on the importance of putting a little bit of humor into your talk, and that actually is the lighten up point in the novel section of this TED Talks thing. And the bottom line is, humor relaxes people. It lowers defenses. It makes the audience is a lot more receptive to your message. So you got to go in and you got to have fun doing that. So, and with PowerPoint presentations, there's actually a section in there in the book that talks about PowerPoint slides. And this is talking about the memorable part. Point number 2 is to paint a mental picture with multi-sensory experiences, or more simply, just visualize the content. And it talks right there. It says, avoid the trap of word-heavy PowerPoint slides. Show more photos, use different types of media, and it's going to make your presentation a whole lot more interesting. But the bottom line is that PowerPoint should just be there simply with an image or some big word on there to maybe guide you, so that people are focusing on you, because you are the show and they're not. You and I are both very familiar with BNI, which I used to be a BNI instructor and director. And one of the things we talk about in there, which is very, very important, you talked about reading from a PowerPoint presentation. The other thing you do not want to do is pass out your materials so that people are reading them while you are talking. When I have handouts, I always tell people to remind me at the end of the meeting and I'll give it to them. That engages them too and makes them laugh. But the bottom line is, I don't like people reading stuff while I'm talking, and it's just not a very good way to present at all, because it is boring and it takes people off subject.
Yes, you never want to hand out the presentation ahead of time. It's fine if you've got handouts and you put them out afterwards, or if the handouts are incomplete. Like if you're giving a handout of your PowerPoint presentation, but there's a lot more in your talk than what's on the slides, that's fine. And that actually gives people a place to take notes a lot of times. But you don't want to hand them your entire presentation. Also, that sort of thing tends to lock you in. You want to be able to adapt on the fly. A number of years ago, I was the first male to give a presentation to the Network of Executive Women in Milford, Connecticut. And I had my presentation all set. But when I got there, I had gotten there a little early, and I was approached by no less than 10 members of the restaurant staff asking me if I was sure I was in the right place. This wasn't something I knew was going to happen. It wasn't planned. But I thought that gave me a fantastic intro to the group. So when I went in, instead of the opening I had planned, I swapped it out, thanking them for giving me the honor of being the first male. And I know I'm the first male because everybody in the restaurant wanted to make sure I was in the right place. Being able to take that real world experience that had just happened and pop it in immediately connected me with the audience.
Absolutely. And that's one of the very, very important points is that you have to know your audience ahead of time. You know where you're going to be talking and so on, but you have to make sure that you put something together that's apropos to them and it's going to keep them engaged. And again, it says to keep it simple, especially if you are talking to a general audience. If you're doing more of a training on specific things, then you can go into more specific things. But the bottom line is the more techno talk you put into your talks, the more disengaged attendees are going to be, the more general the crowd is.
Yes, unless you're in an industry specific presentation, you want to avoid jargon. It puts the audience off if they don't know the jargon, and it makes you sound almost like a textbook. And that's not the way you want to come across. You want to come across personable. You want people to think you are just talking to them. And you can't do that if you're reciting from a textbook and using advanced jargon. You have to make your talk, your presentation, even if it's just to one or two people, you have to make sure it is suitable for those people.
Yeah, and getting back to our 9 public speaking secrets, the first category is emotion, and the first category under emotion is passion. And passion is so important. He uses an example about Amy Mullins, who was a double amputee and a world record holding Paralympic runner. But her talk, she launched the conversation with the way society looks at people with disabilities. But her passion is not about prosthetics, it's about unleashing human potential. And her talk was themed just like that, that speakers, they stand a greater chance of persuading and inspiring your listeners if you can express an enthusiastic and passionate and meaningful connection to your topic. What makes your heart sing? And this, it's really, really important to do that because people buy into passion. They buy into number 2 here, which is the art of storytelling. If you have a personal story or somebody else's story that you can bring into your talk to bring your point across, people love listening to stories and how people have done things. And then the other thing from an emotion standpoint is instead of, like you were talking about before, preaching to the audience, make it like you're having a conversation with them. You're having a conversation with 100 or 200 people, but the more you are doing that, the more natural you are going to appear. And the bottom line is if you can do that, it's going to relax you a whole lot more too.
Absolutely. And the more relaxed you are, the more relaxed your audience is. There are certain things you need to do. And, we mentioned briefly earlier on how important it is for you to know your subject. You need to know this presentation because you need to be looking at the audience, not at your presentation. When you look your audience in the eye, they connect with you a lot more than if you're reading something at a podium. So you have to make this very conversational. Look at the people you're talking to. And to do that, you have to have your presentation down. You have to know what it is, because other than maybe a few bullet points, you don't want to be looking down at a sheet of paper or a teleprompter.
Yeah, and again, the content is really not as important as as the connection is with the people there. You talked about your talk with the women's group, and it's really, really important to start strongly because the bottom line is if you do that, then you have the audience's attention right from the get-go. And you have just a couple of minutes to capture them. So the beginning of your talk is really, really important. So, I mean, if you have something planned, that's great, but you have to make it interesting right from the start. And so entertainment's a good way to do that. Sometimes a good thing to talk about might be a story experience of yourself where you were embarrassed because you did something wrong that you're talking about doing right now. There's a lot of different ways to do that, but you have to plan to make it really, really interesting right from the start of the talk. And it's okay to improvise like you did.
Yeah, as long as you can grab your audience and grab them early. You've got their attention. They want to hear what you have to say. Have fun with it. Play with it.
Yeah, and as you were mentioning, we're talking about the conversation there too. The best thing that you can do is just remember to keep smiling and look out at the audience and make eye contact with them, just like you're having a conversation with them one-on-one. It's really, really important. I mean, they say what body language is about 80 or 90% of the way you are portrayed to whoever's listening to you, and what you're saying is very, very little. It's what you're doing.
And that's true. The more comfortable you appear when talking, the more comfortable your audience is, the better your connection. When you have that connection, you have their trust. Why do you want their trust? Well, you need them to believe what you're saying. You need to convince them you're the expert on this topic, and that's why you're giving this presentation. That's why you're telling them what you're saying. So to get that trust, you need that connection. Once you've got that, they accept that you know what you're talking about, and you've got them hooked.
Yeah, as far as the length of the talks too, the TED Talk, they cannot exceed 18 minutes in length because researchers have discovered that cognitive backlog, which is too much information, prevents successful transmission of the ideas. Gallo suggested speakers, as we mentioned before, should keep in mind the rule of three. In other words, structuring their presentation in three main sections and three takeaways. And that's the type of way that he actually tells you how to do your PowerPoint presentations also. So less is better. And the bottom line is the follow-up afterwards is going to happen really, really well if you keep them curious about that. But you have to have something really succinct to take away, and it's got to be very brief because people won't take it away if they get too much information.
Right. And when you do have a lot of information to convey, you need to break it down. When Apple does their new product presentations, they're generally an hour, sometimes even a little over, but they're broken down into smaller sections. So you have one section where they're talking about the iPhone, and you've got another section where they're talking about software, and another section where they're talking about the Mac. And by breaking it down, they take this longer period and make it, rather than one droning presentation, a series of smaller, quick moving presentations. In fact, after Steve Jobs started to get sick, he started bringing other people up with him. And Tim Cook, who's now the CEO of Apple, followed on with that. So that what you're getting when they do an hour-long presentation is actually 7 or 8 really short presentations, because it's easier for the audience to remember. It's easier for the audience to get engaged. And that ultimately is what you want. You want to engage with your audience. You're giving this presentation for a reason, whether it's to get a job, to get your point across at work, to bring on a new client, whatever it is, you have a reason for doing this.
Yeah, even if it's as small as a 30-second or a 1-minute networking commercial, this is all apropos there too. Don't get too technical. What you have to do is make people interested in you. Another tip, if you're doing a talk in front of a larger audience at a venue, preparing is one thing to know your content, but knowing the venue that you're going to be at and what they have as far as technical equipment and that kind of thing, it's really, really important to know that and go there possibly ahead of time so that you can set things up properly so things are going to run smooth. It's really, really important to do like a quick run through and make sure everything is working.
Right. You need to know your tools, and you also need to be able to know what's going to happen if you don't have them. I actually did a presentation at a bank, and I was told that I had a projector and screen and all of this. So I had slides, I had the whole thing set up. I get there, there had been a snafu. There was no equipment whatsoever. All I had was a bunch of people sitting around a table. So I had to adapt really quickly to giving the same presentation without the visual aids. So you need to be able to adapt that way.
Yeah, even to cover worst case scenarios, if you are, for instance, working off of a PowerPoint presentation, it's not a bad idea to print the slides out and bring them with you to the presentation just in case you run into that type of scenario, so you have a backup. Or these days, you can use a technology like Dropbox or whatever, so if you have your computer, you're able to look into things that way too. But the bottom line is you got to have that with you, and that's really why it's so important to practice ahead of time, so you know your content really, really well and don't have to look at that too often to begin with. So, but you definitely have to be prepared for the what ifs, even if everything supposedly is there.
Absolutely, because you never know what's going to happen. And the better you know your content, even beyond what's in your presentation, the better off you'll be. I had a different presentation. I was supposed to do a follow-up. This was a big event. It was going to be a half-hour webcast, and then I was going to do a 10-minute talk, and then there'd be a 10-minute talk after me. Well, we get there. The person that's supposed to come after me isn't there yet. We're ready to go. But because of the security of the venue, they couldn't connect to the webcast. They couldn't get it past their firewall. So I had a 10-minute presentation that I now had to stretch to 40 minutes. If you know your material, you can do it. Even if you open up, say you stretch 10 minutes to 20 and then use the other 20 to just talk with the audience, to take questions. If you know the material, you have the flexibility to do that. And
Yeah.
that's very important because you never know what's going to happen.
Yeah, and you just brought up a very important point too, as far as leaving time for questions or making the presentation interactive. Ask questions to the audience themselves and get them more involved. I think the more you get them involved, the more engaged they're going to be from up front, and it's going to help you out a lot also. So the more they're involved, the better off you're going to be, and the more they're going to take away from it because they're owning part of it.
Certainly, the more interactive your presentation, the more it feels like a conversation. The more the audience will remember because they're actually involved. They're not just sitting there listening. So if you can get them involved, that's the best way to go. All right, we're coming up on the end of our time. So, Chip, what do you think is the big takeaway for our audience this week?
Well, obviously you have to be prepared up front, but once you are there, we talked a lot about the personal things, such as your passion and telling a story and keeping things interesting. The most important thing is just be authentic. And if you go in there and you know your material and you're prepared to go out and give a very fun presentation to the group, things are going to work out very, very well for you. And the more you do these presentations, the more fun you're going to have.
Absolutely. I think the big takeaway for me is know your material and know your audience. If you know those two things, you can adapt as you need, you can connect with your audience, and you can be incredibly effective. So know your content and know your audience. You've been listening to the Success Showcase. You can catch us every week at xvadio.com/podcasts as part of the Xvadio Podcast Network. Network's available on iTunes, the Apple Podcasts app, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and wherever you find podcasts. Remember, make this your best week ever and make next week even better. See you then.